Hello, everyone. We are back, and this is Jarl and Denise to take it away today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jarl Crocker, Director of Training and Technical Assistance, and I'm joined today by
Denise Harlow, CEO of the partnership.
And thank you all very much for attending the webinar. We had a webinar several months ago for our public agencies, but wanted to make sure that we did a follow-up as we move towards the implementation of the standards to make sure that we have the opportunity to answer any of your questions, and also to let you know what we're doing here at the partnership in terms of developing additional resources and what we have planned at our conference, our annual convention next week. So you can attend those events if you would like, and also give you the opportunity to give us some feedback as we continue to develop those resources to make sure that they're fully taking into account the needs and the interests of our public agencies. So, Cashin, if you could advance us to the agenda for today. We want to talk about three main things this afternoon. First, we want to make sure everybody knows where we are in terms of the ramp up to implementation. So just do some quick updates on where the process is currently and answer any questions that you might have about the implementation. Then we want to do a Q&A on the standards for public CEEs. So we've been getting a number of questions about some of the specific standards, so wanted to make sure that all of you had the opportunity to ask questions about the definition, the interpretation of the standards, questions that you might have around the documentation of the standards, so make sure that there's the opportunity to address those questions. And then third, we'd like to give you an update on the technical assistance guides that we have coming out. We have our first webinar actually scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on the community assessment category. Since there's not a significant amount of difference between the public and private standards, that may be of interest to all of you. So we want to give you a little bit of a preview in terms of what those guides are going to contain, but again, also get your feedback to make sure that when we develop the versions of those guides for our public agencies, that we make sure that they are tailored as closely as possible to what all of you need. And then we'll conclude with just next steps. And again, let you know what's going on at our convention so you can be in the right place at the right time, and then take any concluding questions. So, Denise, unless you have anything to add, we can jump right into it.
Yeah, and we want to definitely hear from you today. I know that we've heard in the field that, you know, when are things coming out specifically for public CAAs? And certainly, as Jarl said, tomorrow's webinar, we're starting our series, and it's on community assessments. And again, in the standards, there are some nuances certainly about public CAAs, and we can certainly dialogue about that today. We want to hear from you about where your concerns sit to make sure that we are able to tailor some of that presentation to you. But we know, at least in that category, there are some of the deviations that there are in some of the other categories like finance and HR and things like that, or some other challenges, whereas under the governance section, certainly the advisory body plays a little bit differently than a governing board does in a not-for-profit CAAs. So we definitely would like to hear from you today. Again, put it into the chat window or raise your hand and we can unmute you at any time. So please go ahead and take advantage of that so we can hear from you.
Great. So where are we in terms of implementation of the organizational standards? So just a couple of quick points to check in on. Again, I'm sure as all of you hopefully know, standards will be implemented in the new fiscal year, which for most states starts on October 1st, although there is some variation across the country in when that starts. But that is the beginning of the time period when our agencies will be assessed against those organizational standards. So it's very important for all of you to be aware of when the state monitoring process actually begins after that date. That's one of the questions that we get. How long do agencies have between the start of the new fiscal year and when that monitoring process occurs, since obviously that affects how you'll prepare to be assessed against those standards, the time you have to get your paperwork and other forms of documentation in place. So I want to make sure that you have all your questions answered about when those time periods actually start. State plans must be submitted to OCS on September 1st. So within the next couple of weeks, the states will have to submit those plans. So things are moving forward relatively rapidly. And again, it's also important to know that most states are continuing feedback processes on the state plan implementation. So state lead agencies are required to engage all of the agencies in their state to make sure that there's an opportunity for feedback about the specifics of the state plan. So that would include both the monitoring and assessment process, how the states are defining the standards, what type of documentation the state lead agency is expecting for that, and also additional issues around things like the technical assistance plan and the quality improvement plans. If agencies are not meeting particular standards, what the threshold is, so what's the difference between a technical assistance plan and a quality improvement plan. We've covered those issues a number of times on previous webinars, but again, want to make sure that as things are moving forward and we're actually on the cusp of actually beginning the first rounds of monitoring and assessment, that we give you an opportunity to answer any questions. So a couple of tips for you before we see if there are any questions around the implementation process. So next slide. So just a couple of things to keep in mind given those upcoming dates. First of all, we think it's very important for all of our agencies to participate in state CSBG lead agency discussions on implementation of the state plan. So we know different states are doing this in different ways. Some have regular conference calls, others have in-person meetings, others have committees. In others, you're primarily giving your feedback to your state association or doing it in more similar sort of committee-based structures. So there are a number of different processes in place, but we think it's really important to make sure that our agencies are using those as opportunities to get their questions answered and to provide the feedback that they need to on the state about those important questions around definition and intent of the standards, what qualifies as documentation, questions around timing, questions around available technical assistance, if there are any issues around actually complying with the standards. So we want to make sure that we know of any issues around states making sure that they are reaching out to their agencies, because that is required that they do that there's opportunity for that feedback. We also want to make sure that all of our agencies are asking for clarification, if needed, on things like the monitoring and assessment process, so when it will begin, how it will be conducted. Again, any questions around definition of the standards and documentation for those standards. So make sure that if there are questions that you have about those issues, so again, questions around the definition, around the documentation, that you're asking your state CSBG lead agencies, that you're working with your state associations to make sure those questions get raised and answered before the implementation actually starts at the beginning of the new fiscal year. We also want to make sure that you're discussing technical assistance needs with your state CSBG lead agency and state association. We know a number of states have already done assessments against the standards to identify where there are particular standards that agencies are having some additional issues around meeting them, and then hopefully drawing up more targeted technical assistance. So we think it's very important if you're seeing particular issues where you need additional support, that's getting communicated both to your state association and to the state lead agency so they can adjust their technical assistance plans and make sure that all of our agencies are getting the support that they need. So with that said, I want to open it up to questions around the implementation of the state plans, questions about that process, and any related issues that might have come up before we dive in to the standards themselves.
That question that's up on the screen, an old question or a new question?
It's not implementation.
Okay, we did have a question that comes. I just want to make sure that the person knew that we had gotten this question about best practices regarding governance for public CAPs. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit later into the webinar. But one of the toolkits that will be coming out is focused on governance. The challenge will be right now, again, there are more nuances with public CAPs. And I should say that CAP Law has some great resources up on their website for public CAPs as well as governance for public CAPs. So I would send you probably directly to caplaw.org for those resources.
And another thing to know about our technical assistance guides that are coming out is in addition to support around documentation and compliance with the standards, all of them include additional resources around best practices. We have a series of diagnostic questions for each of the standards that agencies can use as they're going through their compliance process to, again, look at not just whether they're complying with the standard, but really are they going beyond compliance, are they adopting best practices in terms of the management and operations of agencies. So we feel like these technical assistance guides are fairly robust, and we make sure in the resources section to give you those questions, whether it's guidebooks around doing a community assessment, models of governance structures, resources on the data-related standards. So we're really trying to make sure that those technical assistance guides give you not just the ability to go through the compliance process, but also to go further and hopefully do a deeper review of how your agency is working with those various processes related to the standards, do some either informal or more extended review and evaluation, and provide recommendations for improving performance. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about the guides themselves.
I'm wondering if anybody on the phone, and you can put it in the chat window or the QA window, has been involved in any public hearings yet on the state plan in your state, how well they're able to address the needs of public CAPs around the standards. Are there any nuances that states are including? But do you have a sense of how that's going out there and how much you have public CAPs been involved? So as we go through here today, maybe you could put some thoughts into the chat window about the role of public CAPs in this implementation ramp-up, because all we get to hear is when we're in the field or when people contact us with issues. So this is a unique opportunity to hear from you what's going on the public CAP side of the house. So, but as we go through, I don't see any other questions coming in. And don't forget, you can hit a raise your hand button and we can unmute you as well if you want to ask us any specific questions.
All right, and if you think of any as we go along, please feel more than free to go ahead and either raise your hand or chime in. We can always come back to this particular issue as we move through the presentation. All right, so next, second item on our agenda, we wanted to make sure that we gave you the opportunity to ask any questions about the standard. So these would be questions around the definition of the standard, questions around documentation, questions around the state monitoring process. So we'll just simply put the standards up on the screen, give you an opportunity if any of those are ones you have questions on, and then continue to move through the standards just so we make sure we get all of your questions answered. So let's walk through briefly Category 1. So Cashin has the standards up on the screen. If you have any questions, again, either hit your chat window or raise your hand. Yeah, so we have a question, do you have any best practices on 1.1? Yes, so again, those best practices are going to be included in our technical assistance guides. They'll be divided into two main sections. The first section in that TA guide for every standard will include those resources on clarifying the definition and intent of the standard. We address potential questions that have come up around compliance, around documentation, making sure that all of our agencies have the resources they need to go through the compliance process. And then that second part of the toolkit, and you'll see an example of this later on in this presentation, is those resources around going beyond compliance to allow you to do an assessment process or an evaluation process that it's, again, completely voluntary. We want to make sure that that's very clear. This is not a required part of the compliance, the monitoring and assessment process. But we wanted to make sure that the agencies had those resources that will cover things like best practices, additional resources you can go to, whether that's how-to guides, manuals, case studies, all of those things are included in those resources sections, and again, those diagnostic questions that you can use as you go through the process to really ask yourself, not just are we complying with the standard, but how well are we complying with the standard, and it'll give you those suggestions for those best practices you can implement or resources that you can go to look for additional ideas to improve your performance around the different standards.
Specific, though, to demonstrating low-income folks' participation in its activities, right? So we'll have to look to see what's in the tool guide or the toolkit specifically around best practices in that area. Again, I'd probably refer you to CAP law a little bit in terms of their training on public CAPs, but I think it really depends. Public CAPs are as diverse as the nonprofits. So many of you probably have low-income folks engaged in your advisory board. I think that you could definitely, if you have low-income folks actually sitting on the advisory boards, I think that certainly works to your favor that you could talk about that. Some of you may be engaging folks in volunteer activities in the community, or you're doing a literacy program and you're bringing in people to read to kids, or you're doing a peer-to-peer exchange or a fatherhood initiative and you're bringing in peers to help young fathers in terms of engaging with their youth. My guess is you have a lot of different ways through the programs you operate that there are probably some low-income folks engaged in your activities. So certainly the standard talks about having a process to document that and talk about that. It doesn't say you actually have to have had low-income folks involved in your activities, but if you do, how do you demonstrate and document that process? So I think that those would be some suggestions, at least initially.
And I think another important point is that even though we are rolling out these TA guides for our private CAPs first, I think it's very important for all of our public CAPs to go ahead and read through those, because there might be sections that we would need to adjust or change based on your own unique circumstances. So if you read through those and provide us feedback, we can better tailor the versions that will come out shortly after the versions for the private agencies come out. But again, walking through the ones that are coming out for those private agencies, again, we're very open to getting feedback from all of you to make sure that they're taking into account your needs and interests. So I would encourage you to look at those the TA guides for the private agencies so you can give us direct feedback on how to improve them to make sure that they really meet the needs of our public CAPs.
I say comments come in about there is a concern, at least in one of the states or one of the agencies that's on the phone, that their state has done the public CAP has not been involved in public hearings, but there is a concern about a lack of public understanding about how priorities are necessarily selected, that CDBG maybe do a better job of conducting public hearings in their particular state or community. I think it does ebb and flow probably, so that is helpful to know that there are some challenges going on in your state, and we'll make sure to make a note of that as well to see if we can be helpful in that area. I know OCS is kind of waiting to see what these state plans look like come come September 1 to kind of see what the lay of the land looks like, and then hopefully we can be doing some targeted interventions, or not interventions, but technical assistance in places where we can maybe ramp that up for the next time around. Another question has come in, do you have examples of customer satisfaction surveys for public CAPs? That's a great question, and again, like Jarl said, a lot of the stuff that's in the private CAP one could potentially also be used for the public CAP. My guess is you're going to have a few more hurdles to go through to get those customer satisfaction tools screened, depending on the structure of your public CAP, but it's a similar process in terms of some of the core questions. We have a toolkit up on our website from Eastern Idaho. They won the Award for Excellence a couple years ago, and they have just a simple 5-question postcard that they use for customer satisfaction, and I think a lot of those core questions apply directly to public CAPs as well in terms of how did, were they actually satisfied? Did they get their needs met? What was the quality of service like, and things like that. So, but as public CAPs, you're probably going to want to make sure you check in with some of your QA folks at the city level or at the county level to see if there are some existing products that already been kind of vetted by your public entity.
Right, and we think one of the benefits of going through the process of producing these TA guides and going through the monitoring and assessment process is it'll also show us where we need to focus in on some additional technical assistance resources. So if you have ideas for additional resources that we as a partnership can develop, by all means let us know, and we'll make sure to incorporate that into our plans as we look towards the next fiscal year and the resources that we're developing on the training and technical assistance team.
Another question, is it enough to create a system to gather customer satisfaction? What happens if no data is collected due to unresponsiveness of customers? Good question. And you can't control that, right? And I should go back to the best practices. I was at a CAP recently. It wasn't a public CAP, it was a nonprofit, but a similar methodology. They had iPads sitting at the customer service or the customer check-in desk that had just a regular survey refreshed every time a new customer came to the window, that a customer could enter in their customer satisfaction level right on site when they were checking out of after receiving services. So if you were doing YKEEP intake, or if you were doing emergency services intake, or any sort of programmatic piece where someone would need to check in or check out, perhaps that would be an avenue as well for a public CAP. But sorry, back to the other question here. Is it enough to create a system, right? So the standard is the department has a systematic approach for collecting, analyzing, and reporting customer satisfaction data. If you have a system and you're using that system and you're not getting people to give you feedback, that is out of your control. So my guess is the state would push you a little bit to say, well, did you actually get the survey out? What methodology are you using? But I think as long as you've implemented your system, you're fine.
Now, the one thing to add to that, though, is there are a couple other standards that ask you to use your customer feedback, customer satisfaction data in various other processes. So I think at a certain point the agency does need to at least get some minimum level of customer satisfaction data. So things to do would be to have focus groups with your customers. You might offer some incentives, whether it's a modest payment or a free lunch to come in. You might work with your intake staff to be a little bit more focused on engaging your clients as they come in, but there are several other standards that do require you to use that customer feedback data. So it's important that if you're getting low levels of feedback from your customer, that you figure out what you need to do to actually get some of that data so you can use it in other processes.
We have a toolkit that was developed by CAPSLO, Community Action Partnerships in Hemlow, Obispo, California. That, again, a nonprofit CAP, but again, they had a survey process, but I think they also engaged some standardized questions as part of regular intake and meeting with clients. So I think that gets to kind of what you're saying, is if you can institutionalize some wrap-up questions at the end of visits, that if they're not able to or want to respond to a survey, or if they don't want to come to an evening activity or a focus group, could you institutionalize some typical questions at the end of every encounter around how was today's visit on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that, that you could begin to collect.
We have another question. If we subcontract our CSBG funds and the agencies we subcontract to conduct customer surveys, does that suffice for Public CAAs requirements by association?
It's an interesting question, right? Who's the customer? If you're subbing it all out, I think if I was a state monitor, I would take those customer satisfaction data that you have from your subs, because that's really the end customer, although technically, I guess, your customers, the public CAP, would be those nonprofits that you sub out to. So in some ways it may even be easier if you need to survey your sub-grantees, as it were, about their satisfaction with your services. We have a blend, right? Some public CAPs do the work themselves, or they have the staff and they're meeting with clients. We have other CAPs, public CAPs, who farm it out, who subcontract it out to other, and some of you do both. You do some in-house and some of you sub out. So I think the intent is around what's happening with the families, but my guess is I think you could potentially say your primary customer are those sub-grantees and what's their level of satisfaction, and they're much easier sometimes to get to respond to a survey. So.
Right, but again, something to make sure that you clarified with your state CSBG lead agency. Do you need to gather that customer data from your subcontractors, or more importantly, do you need to make sure that your subcontractors are gathering that data from their clients, which could be an added layer of complexity because obviously you don't always have direct control over those kinds of activities. So maybe something to make sure when you develop your contracts with those subcontractors that the standards are addressed to make sure that you're getting the data that you need from them.
Another question, are there guidelines as to how often these surveys or focus groups, for instance, need to be conducted? We do our needs assessment every 3 years. Is that sufficient? I'd have to refresh my memory about some of the other standards, but I don't know if there's anything in there about an annual update of customer satisfaction. And you do need to use that satisfaction data in your community assessment, and you need to use it in your strategic plan, which has a 5-year cycle. The standard here talks about a systematic approach. I think a best practice is you're going to be doing it probably more frequently than every 3 years. It's something that's kind of built into your agency, but again, I believe that's going to be considered a best practice. As long as you have a systematic approach, again, you're probably going to have to talk with your state CSBG agency to see what their sense and how they're going to define met and not met in your particular state. I would try to probably find a way to ramp it up than once every 3 years because things shift, staff shift. You're trying to get at needs and resources oftentimes at that that community assessment time. This is much more around customer satisfaction, about how satisfied they are with your services. So I think I would argue for more frequent than every 3 years.
Right. I was just talking with an agency that won our award for excellence, so they obviously have a fairly high standard in terms of how they work with this particular issue. But they gather their customer satisfaction data on a monthly basis. It's reviewed by an internal committee quarterly, and then that review process goes to their management team so they can address any issues that have come up around customer satisfaction with their various programs. Now, that's definitely not required, but I think that gives you a sense of what a very high-performing agency does in terms of the way it works with its customer data. But that also tells us that we might want to develop some additional resources or organize the resources that we have around how to do those customer satisfaction processes.
Good question. Great. All right. Did we get them all? All right. So
Category 2.
Category 2. Good.
I'd give everyone a chance to read through those. So questions on Category 2? Going once? Up.
All right. Let's see. Oh, raise the hand. All right. Mona, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, wow. So my question is, as far as standard 2.4, when we're documenting the number of volunteers, is that related to the number of volunteers for staff as well as individuals who would be participating in events, or what would you recommend for that particular area?
When you say for staff, are you like when volunteers come in to help out in the office or run programs or
yeah, right. So all of those individuals, but sometimes we have staff members who also participate on committees to help to create programs for low income. They may sit on boards. So are we only supposed to be documenting when it comes to the volunteers from the outside and not for any of the volunteer hours of our staff?
That's a really interesting, nuanced way to look at the standard. That is, I've not heard that particular question asked in such a way, so that's great to kind of have now in the back of my mind when we think about this standard. The standard is intended to be outside folks who are volunteering on behalf of the program because that's kind of what gets counted in the IS report now. one of those big numbers in the IS report every year, the number of volunteer hours throughout the network and the value of that time. Okay. But I love that concept, though, that, and a lot of the privates have this too, right? The staff are out in the field volunteering at night, serving on boards, doing their own, you know, that's an interesting thing that we need to be thinking about, the altruistic nature of CAP staff, whether you're in a private agency or a public agency. But yeah, this standard is primarily what we think about in terms of people donating time to the agency, to the department, to be engaged in the activities.
Right, and I think that would certainly be something that you might want to document voluntarily, just to show the level of effort that your staff puts in, you know, in addition to their paid hours. Also think it's important to clarify there's at least one state that is saying that it's going to require its agencies to document the volunteer time that their staff put in, but this would be any kind of volunteer time, so not just working, you know, on community programs, anything that they volunteer for, if it's the local animal shelter, a political campaign. We certainly think that is beyond the intent of the standard. That's an additional burden that's placed on the agency. But again, I think documenting those hours for your staff would just generally show the value that you bring to the work, but would most likely not be required by the letter of the law.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Rand, let's see. We're going to unmute you, and you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Another sort of nuance in that volunteer, if you're working with another nonprofit agency who is, as a part of the partnership, uses volunteers and sends a volunteer to participate in a community activity that's sponsored by the CAP, are we including that as a documented, demonstrated partnership or as a volunteer hour, or is it both?
Where do you currently count it in your IS survey report?
I'm not sure, because it's a question we've asked with no good answers recently.
Yeah, because what you're talking about, right, do you get the credit for the delegates?
Yes, so is that volunteer volunteering on behalf of the activity of the CAP, or is that volunteer volunteering on behalf of the partner agency, and therefore where is that being counted? I guess you can make an argument maybe for either way as long as you're consistent, but wondering if you had a better, more clear definition as we try to standardize that.
I'd probably put it into the partnership category myself, and because it is that agency who's benefiting, your money's getting leveraged, right, because you've subbed out money to this nonprofit, and they're able to do more work because they have volunteers, but they probably have a number of different funding streams to run that program. I think this would count if you had volunteers, if you were running programs at your own local department and engage volunteers. I would probably put that in partnerships. I don't know if you think.
I think that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. That's kind of what we've been doing, but again, it's that sort of gray area between those two.
Yeah, because I know Jeannie has been clear that the delegates don't have to comply with the standards. So your delegate, I mean, other than your contracts you have with them, but they don't have to be, your delegates don't have to have all of these 50 or 58 because they would be nonprofits in those scenarios. So, yes, that's the way to go.
And sometimes those partners don't receive money. It's just simply pure community partnership, and they're not necessarily receiving funds through CSBG. They are just, CSBG might support a network activity, but that agency is not getting funds that they're directing on to clients or for their own activity.
Could you shoot us an email with that question more specifically, Rand? It'd be interesting to shoot that over to NASCAS in terms of an IS question.
Sure, happy to do that. And if I forget, I'll be reminded next week when I run into you.
Fair enough. Great, thank you.
A question from George Cashin, if you want to unmute. We've got.
Volunteer hours of staff is very sensitive. Yes, I would be very careful about staff volunteering. Exactly. The comment is volunteer hours of staff is very sensitive to Fair Labor Standards Act regulations. You're right. I mean, an hourly employee cannot volunteer on behalf of their own organization. Even a salaried employee, it really is work if you're volunteering on behalf of the agency. Once a hourly employee reaches, they have to get paid for every hour that they work, and an hourly employee really cannot volunteer for an agency because there's no way to say whether or not that they've been coerced into volunteering. So that's a very good point. Thank you for that caveat. Oh, department communicating activities. The department selects data for annual reports, et cetera, and may choose not to highlight all or some of CAB agencies' activities in a given year. Does this still meet the standard?
For 2.3.
2.3.
So basically the challenge might be that your larger department is the one ultimately who's doing the communicating to the rest of the community, and if they're not communicating about your work, you don't necessarily have that ability to, on your own, meet the standard.
Yeah, as long as it's some of your activities, I think that's fine. My guess is all caps, there's probably some information that doesn't get communicated out. So I think the intent behind the standard was that there's some sort of discussion about what either the department is doing or the municipality is doing around poverty or families and families engagement, family empowerment. Depending on the nonprofit side, the idea is that they're talking about some level of outcomes for their agency's work, but not specifically this program did this and this program did this and this program did this. So I think you would be fine, I would imagine.
Right, and I would certainly suggest that you talk to your overall department to see if there's a way to make sure that in reports that are issued or other communications activities, there's a little set aside for the work that's done with CSBG dollars. The other thing might be if you have a section of the web page, you could use that for updates or similar communications. If you have email or mailing lists, that's another thing that you could do I think, to meet that standard. So there might be some, additional flexibility that hopefully doesn't place too much of an additional burden on you. But I would definitely start by making sure that your overall agency leadership is aware of the standards where they might have to make some accommodations or make sure that you're included when there are communications that go out to the public.
Okay, and I know we have, I think Mona and Rand still have their hands up. So if you, I don't know if they're up again or still up. So if they're still up, if you just click them again, and that'll lower your hand. Great, thank you. And will these Q&As be posted on your website? Interesting question. We will see what we can do to document some of these, and what probably would likely happen is that they'll find their way into the toolkit in some ways. But I'm not sure we can do a full-blown Q&A, but this is recorded, so you'll get a copy of the recording. So you may just want to then fast forward until we get to category 2 and maybe take another listen.
Right, and again, one of the things we do in these technical assistance guides is address exactly the type of questions that you've been asking around documentation, interpretation. So this material is extremely helpful to us because we can go ahead and incorporate that when we do the public agency versions of the guides to make sure that this is included.
Right.
Department communicating activities, the department selects data. Okay, we've
already done that.
We've already done that?
Yep.
Okay, great.
We do use the public website and social media to meet this standard. Excellent. Good. Glad to hear it.
All right, any other questions for category 2?
And Mona, I'm wondering if your hand is up again. We're going to go ahead and unmute you real quick in case there's another question. Do you have another question?
I do not. It must,
okay.
I think I'm going to try to take it back down.
Okay.
No problem.
Just didn't want to miss you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, category 2 going once, going twice. Category 3. And as you're thinking about your question, one of the things that would be helpful for us to know is that in cases where your broader department or agency does a study that is, or similar activity that is similar to the needs assessment that you use instead of doing a needs assessment yourself, are there any issues that come up given the methodology that they use, the way that that is implemented, that might bring up challenges for meeting this particular standard? Mary Beth.
One that's in the Q&A.
The needs assessment is part of our CSBG plan. Does that work for 3.1? It is included in the plan and published on our website.
It would depend. I know some CAP plans, the state does ask you to put in the needs that have been identified in the community. If it includes everything that's itemized in the standards areas, then possibly. And if it sounds like you publish that perhaps separately on your website, then possibly, again, we might want to see it. I don't want to say yes or no probably without taking a look at it. So if you want to shoot us that by email, we'd be happy to take a look and give you at least our opinion on what you think, whether or not it would meet it or not.
Right, and the easiest first cut for you to do would just be to look at those other standards and make sure it meets the standards around quantitative and qualitative data, the demographic data that you collect, so those more technical aspects in terms of the methodology of the plan. But if you shoot it to us, we can, like Denise said, we can take a more detailed look at it.
And does our HUD consolidated plan, would that be a sufficient substitute for a community needs assessment? Again, I think it's the same thing that Charles said, as long as those elements that are required throughout the standards, right, it's not just standard, or it's not just category 3 that fits with needs assessment, there are other elements periodically throughout. So as long as it fits, your HUD consolidated plan does those things, then yes, but there may be some elements that you need to do an addendum. You may need to go actually talk to a few folks. You may need to talk to a few different types of organizations. But if I was, I would try to consolidate as much as possible and see what you can build off of.
Yeah, exactly, and we don't want to add additional burdens on agencies, and that's definitely not the intent of the standard. Again, things that I would check for specifically is making sure there's that key findings section, making sure that there's a clear focus on poverty. I mean, I would assume so, but this is where we see sometimes our private agencies running into trouble when they subcontract out their needs assessment to other organizations that either don't necessarily, aren't familiar with the role of the needs assessment and the work of community action, or are trying to satisfy other interests, their mission, their work. So the needs assessment ends up being diluted or pulled in different directions. Again, I think general rule of thumb, if you use another process, you don't do your own needs assessment, as long as it complies with the methodology requirements, the focus on poverty, has that key findings section, I think that gets it pretty close.
Comments here that a group does coordinate with CDBG every 5 years, which makes sense, but they have to do an update every 2.5 years to comply with CSBG. Yeah, we wish in a lot of ways the 5 and the 3, and then if you look at Head Start too, a lot of the private CAPs combine their Head Start assessment with their CSBG assessment, and they don't always align. So one of these days we'll get to fix that, but probably not today. Good. All right. Go on to category 4.
And this gets into some of the standards where there's a little bit more variance between private and public agencies. So there may be some additional technicalities to take into account. So we're definitely interested in hearing your questions about these standards.
Question has come in. We need a clear definition of department. And someone wants to flip back to one slide. Okay, clear definition of department. We have talked about this a lot internally. And you may recall, many of you may have been on some of our planning calls for public CAPs as we developed the public CAP standards. The challenge, right, is that CSBG, just as it does in the nonprofit world and the public side, it is diverse all across the country in terms of how it's used, how it's implemented, if it's in a standalone department, if it's combined in a housing department or a weatherization department. It really does vary across public CAPs. So the idea behind using the term department was to make it as easy as possible for you. So I would make sure you work with your state CSBG entity to define what you mean by department, and to say that we only, it's kind of what your CSBG, what your tripartite advisory board or body has oversight around. It may just be CSBG. If that's the case, then the standards really kind of apply to CSBG only, but the challenge certainly gets into reporting. And that's not the standards issue, and I know that's an ASCAP area in terms of reporting on your IS report when you have to talk about all the customers you serve and all the outcomes you achieve, how broad you go as a public CAP level, because at a private CAP, it's all their programs and all their services and all their outcomes. Where the line gets drawn for publics is probably a bit more nuanced and specific to each individual public CAP. So our recommendation would be to keep it as simple and as clear-cut for you as it possibly can be. It's not going to be the same everywhere, unfortunately. I don't think I have anything to add.
No, and when you're defining department, I would define it in whatever way is most advantageous to you, right? Because some of the common questions are that we get are, do we have to gather data that covers all of the services that our whole agency provides? Those types of questions, you have to basically account for all the activities of your overall agency. In almost all cases, the answer to that question is no. We're really focused on what's being done with those CSBG dollars. So the standards ideally should not be interpreted in a way that are making you report on or otherwise have to address non-CSBG related activities in the rest of your department or agency.
Question is, what does it mean to have poverty in your mission statement? Is there guidance? And another question kind of relates to that. What does it mean to be assured that poverty is being addressed because the advisory body doesn't have any control over the department's mission statement? Now, so the word poverty does not have to be used. Now, the idea here is that your department, if not your department, then your advisory board has adopted a mission statement for the work that you do. Now, if your department or your municipality says, we're not going to do a mission statement, that we're just not going down that road, we're here to do these services, then that's okay. Then your advisory board or your advisory body would come up with a mission statement that kind of defines the work that you do. And you don't have to use the word poverty. You can use economic security, family self-sufficiency, anything that kind of conveys movement for families toward economic security, I think is certainly accepted. You do not have to use the word poverty. Now, if your department says the advisory body can't have any control over it and this is what we're doing, I think there's some conversations you could probably have with CAP law. But the advisory body really should have a level of engagement with your department, with setting the direction, and ideally even looking at budgetary issues, decisions on where programs are invested, role in the assessment, which I know for many of you doesn't necessarily happen at the end of the day. So if there's some distinct issues there, I would refer you to CAP law to get some advice on how to navigate some of those nuances. But ideally, if your department's not going to be able to do something, I'd use your advisory body to, even if it's not going to have the full effect of the law with your department or with your powers that be, your advisory body says, okay, we're dedicated to addressing poverty or addressing family self-sufficiency in our community, and we're going to be focusing our efforts on that task. So as much as you can kind of have your advisory body do things that you may not be able to do as a municipal employee, I think that'd be a way to go as a possible recommendation.
At Standard 4.4, we provide programmatic updates at each board meeting that may not specifically say this is how successful this strategy has been. It does include our reported outcomes and tweaks. Does that sound like it meets the standard?
Yes, I would say it does. Programmatic reports, you have to have programmatic reports out there. Oops, what happened to this question? Sorry.
Our business hours of operation are Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m.
We just have a little bit of noise. We want to grab
a
So yes, meeting the standard means that you have a programmatic report updating on what has changed. I believe in the standards is an annual activity that the board needs to kind of reflect on what has or hasn't happened. Are there any changes to be made in how the program gets implemented in your community? And as long as the advisory body has had those conversations, I believe just once a year, that's not something that has to happen every board meeting, but as long as they get some level of programmatic report at the board meeting, you should be fine. Sorry, at this point, Charles is probably much more knowledgeable about the individual standards. They'll get blurred in my head at this point. Question, if the CAP board doesn't have input into other, okay, never mind. Where is the local government's risk assessment is not complete? Can a department risk assessment be enough to be in compliance? I would say so. I think we left it out to the broader because oftentimes a municipality government is going to have other risk assessment mechanisms in place that supersede a department's ability to do it, but if the department's doing it, I think that's even better.
Sure.
I think you're fine. Okay.
About 10 minutes left.
Yeah, we're keeping an eye on the clock, and I have to scoot out a couple minutes before the top of the hour, so we're going to scoot ahead, but you're in good hands with Jarla and Cashin and Natalie behind the scenes. So.
Yeah, and we can stick around and continue to answer questions past 3 if folks want to stay on. All right, Category 5.
Five should be pretty straightforward, right? It's all the tripartite board stuff that's been in the Act for 30 years, so hopefully folks are going to be pretty comfortable with most of that. Let's see, go to the next one. So again, for public CAP bylaws, may not be the terminology of art that you're using with your advisory body, but there's odds are some level of document that talks about how people get selected, how decisions get made, when meetings are. In our parlance, that would be the equivalent to the bylaws for the public CAP. Okay, question come in. Let's see.
What does assured mean when a public CAA's tripartite board is usually an advisory board and does not have the ability to change our department's mission statement?
I think we talked about that already.
Okay.
Yep. For a public CAP, what does democratically selected mean? It means probably something very similar that it does to the private CAP. We've had a lot of the responses from private CAPs too. What does it mean to have a written democratic selection process? And this has been in statute previously, so this isn't necessarily new, but a lot of times this hasn't necessarily been something that's been looked at. So again, in those governing documents, whether they're bylaws or selection processes for your department, there should be some level of description about how do you select those low-income reps on your advisory body. Some folks do petitions, some folks do community center gets to nominate somebody. Whatever your process is that you select that part of your tripartite, I would write it down and adopt it as a advisory body procedure. I wouldn't put it in the bylaws necessarily. I would make it a procedure. But okay.
Any other questions for Category 5? Okay. Category 6. And this is a set of standards we've been getting a number of questions on, specifically that relationship between the department and the overall agency.
Just the caveats come in, making sure that your state agency is okay with your client selection procedure. That's a very good point. Many states have taken a close look at the tripartite board selection process, including the low-income sector, and I'm sure they probably have an opinion. Now, as the local CAP, you kind of get to decide as long as it's in compliance with the statute. You get to determine what that process looks like. So again, I put CAP law in your back pocket as a resource for you as well.
And again, another thing to point out is, as you're thinking of any additional questions, that standard 6.4, customer satisfaction data and customer input collected as part of the community assessment is included in the strategic planning process or comparable planning process. So again, that's one of those crossover standards. Again, you need to have that customer satisfaction data, not just for Category 1, but also for your strategic plan and community assessment.
I'm going to have to leave to take a phone call. I'm going to leave you in Jarl's hands. If for some reason my call goes short, I will be back. So we'll see you, many of you, in San Francisco next week. We have a couple of things that Jarl will be talking about specific for public CAPs. So thanks, everyone.
And unless there are any additional questions on Category 6, Category 7. And again, this is one of those categories where there's a fair amount of difference between public and private agencies. So this is one that we want to make sure we get any additional questions or feedback, especially as we develop those technical assistance guides to make sure it's really meeting your needs. Question that has come in on Category 6 on strategic planning. Do you know of any comparable docs to a strategic plan if our department does not have a strategic plan?
If I were going to jump in, this is Cash, and sorry I'm kind of the disembodied voice out to the side here, but basically it is a strategic plan. It just doesn't actually have the term across it that this is the strategic plan, but all of the tenets are basically the same. So it is looking for that meeting the definition of strategic plan regardless of whether it has that title.
Right, so again, there is no single template for what a strategic plan has to be. Again, you just have to ask yourself, what is the intent of the standard? So again, you can do a relatively compressed strategic planning process, if you need to, or use a related document, again, a planning document that takes a long-term view. I think that could arguably serve as a strategic plan. Again, that's something definitely to clarify with your state CSBG lead agency. But a strategic plan does not have to have official strategic plan, stamped and notarized at the top of the document. As long as it is a strategic plan-like document, I think you are okay as long as your lead agency is fine with that as well.
Sure, and kind of the follow-up question about what kind of defines it as a strategic plan, it is that it is more visionary, it's more reaching, it's more hopeful, it's kind of, here's what we hope to be able to do, this is what we're reaching for. And it is, so that kind of, it's a planning document, but not in the same way that like your CSBG plan or an individual work plan might be, which are really focused on we are going to serve X number of people in this time frame. It's that long-range reach.
Right, so it's only required every 5 years because it is a long-term plan. I've seen strategic plans that are only a couple of pages long. I think that those would certainly satisfy the letter, if not necessarily the spirit of the law, because really the intent is to make sure that you've gone through a process where you're looking at more than an operational set of questions. But otherwise, one of the things, again, our technical assistance guides will have in them are either links to sample documents, links to how-to manuals, guidebooks. So hopefully they'll provide those additional resources, and you'll have templates that you'll be able to download that'll hopefully help you walk through that process a little bit more quickly. Also, we at the partnership are in the process of developing a broader array of TA resources around strategic planning that has been identified as the top technical assistance need. So we will have additional support coming out for strategic plans for both private and public agencies.
All right, great clarifying question that we went back to there, and apparently the HR section is clear as a bell for everybody because I haven't seen any questions specifically on the HR section. So
going once, going twice. All right, category 8. So again, like HR, the finance category is one with some significant differences just because you're probably operating according to your larger department or agency's financial policies and procedures, but again, want to make sure that we've addressed any technical questions about those differences or potential constraints that you might run into since you're working with those overall policies and procedures that you don't have the kind of flexibility a private agency would have to either implement or operate by. All right, going once. We can always come back to that as well if there are any additional questions. Again, there's also a number of standards that are not applicable for the reasons that we just talked about. So, Cashin, if you'll advance us to category 9. And again, this is another category that we've gotten some questions about, again, because the data collection procedures for your broader agency might raise some challenges. So take a look at the standards. Let's give you a few more seconds. All right, we have one question from Andrea. Does the data tracking system need to cover all of the department's programs in one system? Again, I think that's one of those questions about the relationship between your particular department and the broader agency. I believe the answer to that question is no, you don't have to have one single system. There is that plural in there, so you have a system or systems in place. So there is some flexibility there. Right, we know one of the challenges with these data standards is that you sometimes use different software to collect and report data. That makes it difficult to do things like get an unduplicated count or otherwise have the different databases talk to each other. Again, I think the CSBG committee, when they were writing these standards, tried to be as sensitive as possible to not setting that bar too high in terms of what your databases could do, what was being required of data collection. So again, I think there is some flexibility, but it does not have to be one overall system. Right, and unless there are any additional questions about Category 9, we will move on to just briefly talking about the toolkit development. I don't want to keep you all too much past our allotted time, but do want to give you a brief overview of what's going to be in those technical assistance toolkits. And again, it's very important that we get feedback from all of our public agencies to make sure that as we roll out those public technical assistance guides, we are tailoring them to meet your needs, because we'll obviously use the guides that we've developed for the private agencies as the foundation for this, for what we do with the guides for the public agencies. But we just don't want to repeat ourselves because there are some significant differences. So overall, two purposes to these technical assistance guides, like we mentioned. The first is to assist with the definition, intent, and documentation of the standards. So the first two sections of every toolkit for each standard will review the definition and intent of the standard. provide some basic background information, why it was included in the overall list of standards, and then we'll go through some of the questions, much like the questions that we've asked here, about the documentation, about the interpretation of the standard. So if you have any additional questions as we move forward with the implementation process for those state plans, by all means send them to us so we can incorporate them into these technical assistance guides. Just the questions for today have been extremely valuable for us as we think about how we're going to put those TA guides together for public agencies. So this is exactly the kind of feedback that we need. The second part and second reason for the toolkits or the guides is to provide resources to go beyond compliance. So many of you were asking for best practices, examples of things like strategic planning processes, consumer involvement processes. So these TA guides will include a set of diagnostic questions that you can ask as you go through your overall compliance process with the standards to, again, ask some of those deeper questions about not just are you in compliance with the standards, but how well are you doing when it comes to the management, the operations, the day-to-day work that are involved with not just the standards, but everything that those standards touch on. In addition, there'll be those resources that we'll connect you to. So we've got resource lists at the end of every section of the toolkit, along with those diagnostic questions. And Cashin, if you could advance it one set. So what we do in the toolkit is walk you through some basic guidance on how to go through your assessment process. So we include some, again, basic questions that you can ask as you're getting ready to go through the assessment process for the first time, just to make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's. So we encourage you to ask questions like, how is the review connected to processes to document the other standards? So we know some agencies are going to go through the compliance for all 9 categories all at once. Other agencies are going to divide them up. They might do the reviews for different categories at different times. So we have some guidance around how to make sure that you're connecting those different processes, that you're using similar review procedures, that you're communicating with each other, making sure that you're archiving the documentation in a similar way. We also offer some guidance on making sure that you're looking at opportunities to conduct the review into existing agency processes. So if you're going through that needs assessment process in this coming year, that's a great opportunity to also go ahead and document all the standards for Category 3. So making sure that you've looked at opportunities to do that documentation for the standards if you're already doing activities related to those standards. So if you're developing your strategic plan, again, great opportunity to knock out all the standards, getting the documentation together for all the strategic planning related standards. And we provide some guidance on ways to make sure that you're hopefully not duplicating effort and taking advantage of those opportunities to do the documentation while you're doing other work to hopefully make it as efficient as possible. We offer some guidance on who should participate. So it's sometimes tempting to just have 1 or 2 staff go around and gather the documentation. While that's certainly a valid way of going through the assessment process, we also suggest that you consider creating small staff teams to go through that process. It's a good way to build staff capacity. It's also helpful to do that deeper dive, that beyond compliance evaluation process that we're suggesting agencies do. Also have some questions around how staff will determine how the standards are met. Since obviously this is the first run through the standards, there are going to be continuing questions about the definition and documentation around those standards. So as you go through your first assessment as an agency, making sure that your staff are all on the same page about how that process works. So we provide some additional guidance around that. We also, again, suggest that at the end of the assessment process for each category, that the staff who are involved in that process make some recommendations for how you can improve your operations related to the standard. So again, that's what those additional beyond compliance resources are that I talked about, those diagnostic questions, those additional resources. We provided worksheets at the end of every technical assistance guide, every standard, where with a section where we suggest staff go ahead and make those recommendations. So again, we think going through the process of assessing compliance with the standards is a great opportunity for the agency to take a step back and look for opportunities to improve the way that it operates in relation to the different areas of your management and operations that the standards touch on. So again, that's what those additional resources in the toolkits are there for, to help build overall agency capacity and help the staff make those recommendations. Lastly, there's some guidance on how staff should archive results, since obviously this is going to be an annual process. Making sure that you're keeping records on how you went through the process the first time is very important, because it's probably not going to be the same staff doing this over and over. So making sure that there is that not just institutional memory, but archival memory, so the next time you go through the process, it's as simple as possible. All right, Kasia, next slide. Again, last thing I want to talk about in terms of the toolkit, again, we do provide some suggestions, some guidance on how to do that deeper dive, that going beyond compliance. So again, for every standard, our toolkit will provide those diagnostic questions and those resources. The most basic thing that your staff could do is simply have a short discussion at the end of the assessment process where they make recommendations to improve whatever it is the standard relates to, whether it's your needs assessment, your consumer involvement work. And so hopefully those resources will be helpful in building staff capacity, but also letting them give some informed recommendations about how to improve management and operations. Another option would be to review the resource materials. So again, we include guidebooks, examples, templates, a fairly wide range of resources that you can use to compare what you're doing either to other agencies, to industry standards. So those resources are fairly comprehensive in terms of letting you benchmark how your agency is doing compared to the rest of how the broader network operates. Another option would be to do internal interviews or a focus group with key staff internally, again, to make sure that you're getting that feedback, those recommendations from staff about how to improve your work. And then lastly, you could conduct interviews or a focus group with outside partners and experts. So again, there are a number of ways that require differing levels of effort that you could do the evaluation component of the assessment. So we're trying to give you some different options. Again, very important to stress, this is not a required part of the assessment process for the standards. These are additional activities that your agency can engage in if you so choose. We're not expecting every agency to go through a full evaluation process using these questions, using these resources. This is something that we're suggesting that you be strategic about in picking and choosing where you do that deeper dive. But again, we just wanted to make sure that these resources were available to build the overall capacity of the network. If you want to see in more detail what is in the Technical Assistance Guide, I would encourage you to sign on for our webinar tomorrow at 2 o'clock, where we will go through the guide for Category 3, the community assessment. Again, I think since there's almost no difference between the standards for public and private agencies for that one, it'll be, I think, just as applicable to all of your work. And you can also see if there are any places where we need to take specific issues related to our public agencies into account. Again, a number of those questions about agencies that do similar processes to a needs assessment, but it's not a needs assessment done specifically on CSBG. I think those are the kinds of questions that will help us tailor our guide when we do the version for our public agencies. But again, would encourage you all to be on that call so you can see what these guides look like and give us that feedback as we continue to develop the companion guides for our public agencies. The last thing I want to touch on today is next steps. Again, we know many of you will be at our convention next week. We have in addition to a number of sessions related to public agencies, We have a time set aside in Cashin. It is Wednesday when our affinity groups are meeting? Or Thursday? Yeah, so Thursday, there's a time set aside for affinity groups to meet. We have a specific affinity group for state agencies where we will continue the discussion about the standards, so we would welcome all of you to join us at the affinity group meeting, and obviously we will have additional webinars and similar events as we continue to roll out our technical assistance guides. We will have webinars for every TA guide that we put out, so that will be another place where you can ask additional follow-up questions. And we might also, if there's a demand for it, have similar follow-on webinars to this one to give you additional opportunities as you're actually going through the first year of the assessment and monitoring process to make sure that we are answering your questions as those are underway. So Denise, with perfect timing, is here to take us home, but thank all of you for signing on and hanging in there with us.
See you in San Francisco. Fabulous.
So any concluding questions about the convention before we sign off? That is our next opportunity to talk to a lot of you in person.
Did you talk about the need for potential public caps to join us on that 2 o'clock presentation or workshop slot to see if there's any other public caps who might want to participate by any chance? No,
but we can add that into the mix. We talked about the affinity group meetings on Thursday.
On standards. At 2 o'clock on Thursday during convention week, we have a presentation lined up. It's entitled The Role of Public Caps in Large Cities Across America, because we know there are a lot of public caps. If you would like to be part of a panel presentation or be engaged in that conversation, if you could shoot me an email. We have at least one panelist, but it might be helpful to have another 2 or 3 of folks who might be willing to talk about what you do really well as a public cap. In an American city. It doesn't have to be a large city. I think people are always interested to hear what's working really well in a public cap. So please shoot me an email, and I see we have a few folks putting into the chat window that you are interested. We will definitely follow up with you. So thank you, Sharon. And we look forward to seeing many of you both at that session in San Francisco as well as the affinity group to have these in-person dialogues about standards.
Great. And a quick question from the group: will we need to register for the session on Thursday? Nope, you just have to show up.
Yes, if you are in San Francisco, the affinity group will get you the room, but there'll be a sign probably up by the registration desk about what specific rooms, or probably in the daily update actually that we hand out to attendees about what rooms the affinity groups are in. And then the 2 o'clock workshop will just be in the program book that you get when you show up at the convention. So.
Great, so thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing hopefully as many of you as possible at our convention next week.
Great. Thanks.